I've been looking at a very interesting video where Jordan Peterson interviews Netanyahu uh, 10 months ago, just after he'd been elected as prime minister again, but before he'd taken office. And Netanyahu talks very convincingly about the rights of the Jewish settlers uh, during the Zionist period from the late 19th century, and particularly from the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And uh, my initial response to listening to him was that he was wrong. And because I've always worked on the principle that the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, or from Israel, from the state of Israel, from the original state of Palestine in 70 AD, and that the Romans then renamed the land of Israel, the land of Judea, Palestine, that was a Roman name. And I think that's partly correct, but it's not wholly correct. And Netanyahu was very clear. He said that the Jews had lived in the land, in the Holy Land, until the 6th century AD, the 6th century after Christ. And he says the loss of land took place decisively with the Arab conquest in the 7th century. And under the Arab conquest, the Jews never lost their desire to go back to their land, as evidenced in the Passover prayer next year in Jerusalem. And he then goes on to talk about how the Arabs who had taken over the land left the land barren. And he cites two people who went to the Holy Land during the 19th century. First, Mark Twain, and then Arthur Stanley. And he says he contrasts this with the speech, the very famous speech made by Yasser Arafat in the United Nations, when Yasser Arafat said that the Jewish invasion began in 1881 and it destroyed the Palestinian paradise. And Netanyahu says, well, what paradise? What paradise was there? Arthur Stanley, the explorer, said, I see nothing here, a barren expanse. When, oh, when will the Jews come back and bring this land to life? Mark Twain, who went to the Holy Land in 1869, so before the 1881 date when Yasser Arafat says the Jews invaded and destroyed the Palestinian paradise, Mark Twain said it was a vast wasteland, and only imagination can grace this land with beauty. So the idea that there was a Palestinian paradise that the Jewish settlers, the Zionists, destroyed is a fabrication of history. That much I agree with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's second argument is more entertaining. He says that he basically draws on the idea of squatters' rights. He says, if we're in this empty building and we've made it better, we've built factories, we've built agriculture, we've made the land green, then we have acquired rights. But he then goes on and confuses the matter and says, well, actually, all we're doing is we're reclaiming the building that we lost years ago. And the Palestinians, he says, are not free to demand the dissolution of the Jewish state. I think that statement is clear. I think his argument about squatters' rights is a little bit pie in the sky. But let's go back to this idea about whether or not the Jews were exiled after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying religious texts, I've always seen 70 AD as this sort of beacon, this one fixed date in biblical history. And the destruction of the temple took place between 70 and 73 AD, and it resulted in 97,000 captives being taken from Judea and sold into slavery, according to Josephus, who was an eyewitness of all this. And it was then followed very, very quickly by the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132 to 136 against Hadrian, and the result of that was a bloody defeat and the boatloads of Jewish slaves, 12 boatloads of Jewish slaves being taken into Rome, or Cyrenaica, I think, actually, as being displaced anyway. So the idea of diaspora comes from that period. The word diaspora is Greek, and it's actually to be found in the Bible, in the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, and it's found in Deuteronomy 28:25. And you shall be a diaspora, a dispersion in all kingdoms of the earth, and that in the rabbinic understanding in the Talmud, which is a 6th century document, becomes a badge of honor, linking the word galut, exile, with the word geula, redemption. And this is where a very strange group of extreme rabbis that we see sometimes on the internet, who side with the Palestinians and don't want a state of Israel, that is because their reading of the Talmud is saying we are commanded to be a diaspora, a disparate nation, and we are not expected to have a homeland. But in fact, the book of Deuteronomy is supposed to have been written at the time of Moses. It wasn't, of course. It was written probably at the time of Josiah, and it was discovered in the temple in the 18th year of Josiah. And so it was a concoction by temple priests, almost certainly. But what this reading does, I mean, there was a third revolt which was put down in 351 to 352. So that's a Byzantine crushing of a Jewish rebellion. So these three rebellions in 70, in 132, in 351, they actually confirm that Netanyahu is right. And I hadn't thought this at all. My initial response is Netanyahu is propagandizing, and this is not true, but he is right. He is right. And I think he's wrong when he says that the Jews were thrown out of the Holy Land by the Arab conquests in the 6th or 7th century. I don't think that's correct. I think instead they were taxed out of existence in about 717, and it was because from the Bar Kokhba rebellion, it became illegal for any Jew to enter Jerusalem, and that continued. That continued until the Arabs took over the land, and so the and again, something I hadn't really put two and two together because I just wasn't thinking clearly. The Mishnah, one of the great works of Jewish codification, was written in Galilee. One of the great centers of Talmudic and then of Kabbalistic scholarship was around the town of Nazareth, just beyond Nazareth, in a place called Safed, Sapora. It was also, incidentally, the scene of, or the site of, one of the biggest Roman garrisons. And I've always found it extraordinary how in the New Testament there is no mention of the enormous number of Romans who must have been running around the town of Nazareth. It doesn't escape the writers of the Talmud who point out that there was a story that the Virgin Mary had been favoured by a Roman soldier called Ben Pantera, and indeed there is a grave of a Roman soldier in Nazareth attributed to or with the insignia of Pantheus, which would be the Roman version of Ben Pantera. I mean, it's a scurrilous little bit of the Talmud. It's sometimes edited out, but it is there. And the point is, all this activity was going on not in Jerusalem, but in the but certainly in the Holy Land itself. There was still a Jewish presence, a very strong Jewish presence in the Holy Land. I would say not only until the 7th century, but beyond that time. As indeed the community of Mea Shearim, the very religious community, the Hasidic, Haredi community in the center of Jerusalem, has been there for years, well before the establishment of the Israeli state. And so Netanyahu is partly right. Where I think he's wrong is the assumption that Palestinians don't have a right, because I think he's looking at the history in the wrong way. He's looking at the history in terms of antiquity and whether there is authenticity, whether there is a right to an ancestral land. And you go back into the mists of time and it all becomes very vague. There is definitely a right, as recorded in the pages of the Bible, which is incontrovertible. The right for the Palestinians is not as well recorded, not as well documented. But I think we shouldn't be looking at those ancestral claims. I think instead we should be looking at the fact that the Israeli state has been there for 75 years, that the Palestinians have been there, and that these two groups need to learn to live together and to respect one another. And that should be the principle on which a future state or a future two-state solution or a single-state solution should be considered. The language that Netanyahu uses is the idea of a single state ruled by Israel, and I think that's not a positive understanding, and I think that's where a lot of the problems lie. I think there has to be some agreement that there is a Palestinian state, and that is independent but coexistent with the Jewish state, with the Israeli state. And there has to be, I think, given the dramatic events in the 1940s, and also revived by the terrorist attack of Hamas just 2 weeks ago, there has to be a place where Jews can consider this is our last-ditch land of safety. And I remember as a schoolboy reading the wonderful books by Abba Eban, the My People and My Country. And he was a very gifted politician, but more so, I think, a very gifted writer, and a writer who understood that balance. And I think too much effort has been put into the discussion about the origins of Israel and the biblical relevance. And not enough has been talked about the dealing with the reality as we have it now, dealing with the cards that we have in front of us, playing the hand we have been dealt, rather than this constant harping on about the past. This will always be a land shrouded in history. And I think rather than focusing on nationalism, we should be focusing on a federation. As indeed Europe should be focusing on a federation, as indeed we in Britain should be focusing on a federation. We shouldn't be talking about Scottish independence. We shouldn't be talking about Brexit. We should be talking about our federation of countries, locked together in a European ideal which spreads from Ireland through to Ukraine, and maybe even beyond. But Israel should be seen in the same context, maybe even embracing other countries to the north and south. The idea of nationalism as a concept is something that was developed in the 19th century, and it brought with it false and extraordinarily restrictive borders, dividing families, dividing communities. And now is the time to stretch beyond those borders and find a way to live together. A way to live together. And if we can't do that, there is no solution. And I firmly believe there is a solution. So I think I had my eyes open listening to Netanyahu, and I'm pleased I did. I think he's wrong in so many areas, but I was wrong as well. I had my history wrong, so I'm really grateful to be corrected. But I think the fundamental mistake is in trying to go back to that past and say this is our origin. Yes, it is. Yes, it is, but I don't think it's relevant.